we start off with breaking news out of Washington. Call it the art of no deal. The U.S. and Canada set to resume trade talks next week, a story that broke here on CNBC. Canadian Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland hosting a news conference moments ago. Eamon Javers is in D.C. with the very latest. Hi, Eamon.
Yeah, Melissa, what we heard just moments ago from the top Canadian negotiator here in Washington is that they've reached the end of the day today with no deal, but they do have an agreement to continue negotiating, and they'll meet on Wednesday next week. Chrystia Freeland was asked in that press conference about some of the big personalities involved in this intense negotiation. Here's what she said.
How can you possibly negotiate with a guy like Donald Trump who says that he's not going to give any ground? That's not a negotiation, is it? Like, how can you possibly make a deal with someone like that?
My negotiating counterparty is Ambassador Lighthizer. And as I said, he has brought good faith and goodwill to the table. As I also said, it is going to take flexibility on all sides to get to a deal in the end.
Now, the President of the United States not at the negotiating table. He was at an event in North Carolina today, but he continued to send his message into negotiators and his message up to Ottawa. Here's what the President said earlier.
If we don't make a deal with Canada, that's just fine, but we'll see how it all works out. I say affectionately, we'll just have to tariff those cars coming in. That's a lot of money coming into the coffers of the United States.
So something of a threat there from the President of the United States of what would happen if no deal is ultimately reached as these negotiations continue into next week. Meanwhile, administration officials briefing reporters here at the White House just a short time ago said they expect to continue this process. They've officially notified Congress, kicking off the 90-day clock as part of the process here. But they've notified Congress that they intend to have a deal with Mexico and maybe possibly with Canada. Does that pass muster under the statute to do it that way? Officials say they feel they're in compliance with the statute here. The U.S. Trade Representative issuing a statement today saying that they've notified the intent to sign the trade agreement with Mexico and Canada if it is willing. They say that that language is compliant with the statute. We'll see how Republicans on Capitol Hill, who control Congress between now and the election and perhaps after, how they feel about that ability of the White House to feel that it's in compliance with the statute. A lot of complexities and nuance here, but for now, the bottom line is no deal today. Negotiating continues into next week, Melissa.
Eamon, any sense at all as to what the sticking points remaining are?
No. In fact, you heard our Stephanie Du in the press conference asking the minister what the sticking points were, particularly on pharmaceuticals, and they're not willing to reveal anything at this point about where they are on the specifics of all this. You know, one of the issues that the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has talked about this week is what they call in Canada supply management. Their large effort agriculturally, rather than to pay subsidies to farmers to control the overall supply that's produced in Canada. They've been very defensive about that on the Canadian side. They'd like to continue to have that process in place. We'll see whether that's part of these negotiations as well. Unclear, really, where we stand right now. We won't see text for another 30 days. And, of course, given that the negotiations are ongoing, there is no text to see right now. Sure.
Dairy certainly probably an issue there. Eamon, thank you. Eamon Javers at the White House for us. So if you think a deal is going to happen, what do you do? Guy?
Well, you stay the course in terms of the market. I don't know what individual names have been sort of wrecked in terms of the NAFTA breakup, the new NAFTA negotiations.
Auto parts,
yeah,
probably.
But autos, you know, let me talk about autos. Ford and GM have been awful for the last 7 years. I mean, GM had a huge move from May into June, went from 35 to 44. It's given it back. Ford's been basically going straight down for 7 or 8 years. So this obviously hasn't helped, but a relief in this I don't think is going to make Ford and GM a raging buy overnight. So in terms of the overall market, I mean, the VIX still says you got to stay the course. The S&P closes effectively at an all-time high. I still think the big kahuna comes in the form of China. And by the way, Dan Nathan did an amazing job at about 9:45 this morning on MSNBC talking about exactly that point.
Well, no, I guess the point is really important that, you know, Canada is a $1.7 trillion economy, right? And it's only growing at 1.5% or something like that. They are one of our biggest trading partners, but it's really when you start thinking about the EU and China, which have about the similar size of an economy that we do, like if you put them together. And China's growth is the really important one, right? 6.6% growth. If their economy starts to slow because we have a prolonged trade war, then that's the sort of thing that has ripples throughout the market or throughout the global economy.
Does that give the U.S. a more of a leverage? Because everyone says that China can wait, but if their economy starts to slip, Does that give the
Yeah,
U.S.
but so Steve, I would put it back
China
to you guys. If Canada holds out, does that embolden the EU? Does it embolden China? And does this thing go longer?
No, I don't think that Canada has any leverage, and I think that the things to buy are the autos. We saw Ford pop, but then it faded again, so it's off 6%. It's the autos, and it's the China trade.
You're going to get a little bit of help for the autos, obviously, if some deal is arrived at. But the fact is, cyclical stocks, and that's what automotive stocks are. Their cyclical stocks are typically going to trade at the lowest multiples at the peak of the cycle and the highest multiples at the trough of the cycle. The fact that you see these very low PEs, these very low EV/EBITDA numbers in the autos, is telling you that the market doesn't think that this huge automotive industry that we've had over the past couple of years is going to continue. And as far as what you should buy, take a look at what hasn't done well because of this news, and that is emerging markets, and that is Chinese equities. And if you don't know which name to pick, you could look at either EEM or FXI.
So you want to go for the leverage. You want to go for the most bang. I mean, the most beta in terms of what reacts.
Exactly right. I mean, look, I think our market will probably respond pretty well if we get a deal, but it's not going to get the same kind of a pop that EM or FXI would, neither of which are currency hedged, by the way, so that's going to be a double tailwind.
The problem with the autos, too, is that if there's no deal with China, they still face a world of hurt. I mean, we heard it from Ford today when they said that they were not going to import small cars built in China. The tariffs just make it economically difficult. Moody's also downgrading Ford's credit rating to one notch above junk. So Ford has its own set of issues, even outside of, let's say, reaching an agreement with Canada and Mexico, maybe even reaching an agreement with China.
And they've had those issues for quite some time. If ever there was a day where Ford should have just bounced in terms of relief route, it would have been late this afternoon when you sort of saw some inklings that maybe a deal would be done with Canada by Wednesday. It didn't happen. The stock still closed basically on the low. So again, I don't know what set of circumstances helps Ford or GM. Now, GM had that bounce over the summer. I think that had a lot to do with a lot of things that Tim Seymour talks about in terms of their foray in sort of the Tesla world. But that was given back as well. So Mike makes a point. Just because cheap valuations doesn't make them raging buys.
I think Mike brings up that point. Maybe we've seen peak autos. So maybe the ride share, autonomous drive, that's the host of reasons. But I do think you can still see that pop. I agree with you. You should have seen a little bit of a pop today, but that pop was last week, or earlier on this week, I should say. And I think you're going to see that again once we see a deal. It will be short-lived, but nonetheless, you'll see a pop.
You know, there's another potential headwind for autos, which we haven't talked about. The average selling price of cars has risen steadily over time, and the way that consumers have dealt with that is by stretching out the term of their financing. We have very low interest rates. There is tremendous exposure, the longer those loans get, to rising interest rates on top of the rising price of cars. And by the way, we shouldn't focus on the Ford Focus because they don't make any money selling small cars. It's one of the reasons GM got out of Europe.
It's just interesting that, we pose this question, what do you buy when this deal gets done? I mean, to me, I think that there just poses a lot of risk as this gets stretched out across the globe. It doesn't look like the EU is willing to kind of go to terms the way that, they had a handshake deal. Juncker came here in July. They had a handshake deal, and Trump says he doesn't like the deal that they cut. And I just think that you have the potential for the EU and the Chinese to be a bit emboldened by the Canadians. I don't think the Canadian thing is that big of a deal. This was a self-imposed deadline, just so they could kind of map a deal. And when you look at the guts of the NAFTA 2.0 that they're calling it, it doesn't look so much different than NAFTA 1.0 for all intents and purposes. There's some stuff about auto workers and minimum wages and stuff, but they need to be enforced. And those are sorts of things that have not been enforced over the last 25 years. So to me, it's just a bunch of noise right now.